Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. We are very, very excited that you could make the time to join us for this webinar. And we want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. You could be joining us for the first time ever, or you could be someone who regularly attends our Ubuntu Dialogues webinars. Very warm welcome to each one of you. On behalf of the Ubuntu Dialogues team here at Michigan State University, but also at Stellenbosch University, we would like to invite you to join us in the conversation. I'm going to explain the structure in a moment, but I wanted you to know that we really want this to be a conversation. So we'll get to that in a moment. My name is Upenyu Maje. For those of you who are returning, you might remember that we have been together for a while now, for a couple of years. I'm the project manager for the Ubuntu Dialogues at Michigan State University. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Dr. Mariki Olofsson, who is based at Stellenbosch, and together with Mr. Bongani Gijima and Dr. Jamie Monson, the PIs from this program. We are really excited that you could join us. So today's session is one of the webinars that we have put up this year. We also have, before I move on, we have one more webinar this calendar year, and it's coming up on November 11th. We are going to try and put the flyer in the chat box for you in case you haven't received the news yet. But today's webinar is featuring Emmanuel Chima, who is a second-year PhD student at the School of Social Work at Michigan State University here in East Lansing in the US. Emmanuel's research focuses on experiences of forced displacement, youth transitions and aging, and currently he is studying the community at Dzaleka Refugee Camp in Malawi. We are very excited to have you, Emmanuel. We also do have Professor Paul Bukuluki, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work and Social Administration at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. Professor Bukuluki is going to help us in part of the conversation in responding to the work that Emmanuel is going to present. We are also delighted to have Professor Thaddeus Metz, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. We are very, very excited because what we are hoping to do today is to have a three-way conversation at the beginning. Emmanuel is going to speak to us for about 10 minutes, not more than 10 minutes. He is going to lay out the argument in his paper and give us the background information to why this is important, why we should all care about this work. After he is done, we are going to get Professor Bukuluki and Professor Metz engaged with Emmanuel on this work. This will take us about 20-25 minutes. And after that, we are going to open up so that the bulk of our time together is going to be a conversation between all of us and Emmanuel, but also with Professor Bukuluki and Professor Metz. So this is the structure we have. For now, feel free to, if you would like to self-introduce, feel free to use the chat box for that, or share any information about yourself, feel free to do that. We are going to ask you, when questions do come up as the presentation and the conversation goes on, to post your questions or your comments in the question and answer box. That's where we are going to pull them up and read them out to Emmanuel and the rest of the team as we go ahead. Lastly, I would like to say, as the Ubuntu Dialogues team, we are hoping that we can continue in this engagement. If you have exciting events going on in your institutions, please do let us know so that we can help advertise those within our networks. But we also would like to hear from you, your feedback about these sessions, what you want to see more of, what you would like to see less of. And that way we want to continue to grow as a program and involve your feedback as we do that. So right now I want to turn the time to Emmanuel Chima, and we'll give you not more than 10 minutes to give us the argument in your paper.
Thank you, Penyu. So the work we're engaging with today focuses on the Tumani festival. at Dzaleka Refugee Camp in Malawi. It's a festival that's held annually, and it's been in existence for 7 years now. It's refugee founded by Tresor Nzengumpauni, who is from the Congo, the DRC. And essentially, the festival came out of this artistic response to the refugee stigma that's there in Malawi. And so I'll provide a little bit of the historical background there in that the camp came into existence following the civil war in Mozambique that was drawn out. And during that civil war, there were a lot of Mozambican nationals that sought refuge in Malawi. And that prompted the government at the time to come up with a refugee framework to better respond to the refugee crisis at the time. Now, it was drawn up in such a way that was meant to cause the Mozambican refugees to return to Mozambique, and then it remained on the statute books. And then you had the Rwandan genocide and conflict in the East African region, and then there was a new wave of refugees that came into the country there. And so they were subjected again to the same framework that had been put in place specifically with a particular population in mind. And in the time that that framework has existed, there's sort of been this ongoing stigma directed towards refugees, both at law and socially. And so it's against that background that this festival emerged. And really, the festival is a form of art as resistance because the story of the founding artist himself speaks to how he wanted to comment on how refugees are perceived and treated. And so, in the work we're discussing today, really what I attempt to do is to deconstruct the festival and try to point at how it speaks to different aspects of the social situation. And so it's not just that refugees are discriminated against in Malawi, but that there's underlying currents to that. And so I try to comment on the history, like I've alluded to, issues of colonial past, because the majority population of the refugees in Malawi are from Congo. And the history of Malawi as a migrant nation has that the people who founded it came from the Congo. And so I sort of try to draw attention to the things that the general populace is now oblivious to, how if maybe they think a little bit about those things, they would then see that this stigma, this discrimination is not founded, but rather that there's more to gain in celebrating the commonalities between the people groups. And so that's what I speak to in this essay. So yeah, I'm curious to explore more of these issues of identity, um, especially with this lens of Ubuntu, that there's that oneness, because arguably the people that occupy Malawi presently and the refugee community have a shared ancestry, but also there's people from other parts of the continent there, and Ubuntu can still speak to that. And so those are some of the issues that I'm curious about. And for me as a social worker, this work is important to me because I'm invested in the psychosocial well-being of communities. And so I think this festival is important and drawing attention to these psychosocial experiences because it goes beyond traditional humanitarian interventions that look at getting people to places of safety, providing material needs, but just the psyche and the soul is as just as important. And so, which is why I appreciate this festival that Tresor gets us to really think about the things that make us people, and it humanizes refugees and provides that bridge between the refugee community and the host community. So that's sort of the broad overview. And I look forward to having this conversation with Professor Metz and Professor Bukuluki and talking more about this essay, which they got to read, and hopefully we'll share more with the audience, given that I just gave a broad overview of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for the broad overview. And we would like to invite Professor Bukuluki and Professor Metz. Feel free to come in as you wish, but hopefully we can get a question each from you, and then Emmanuel can respond to that, and then we go to the next set of questions, if that is okay.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for that brief about your work. Very exciting indeed. I was super excited listening to you. Thank you very much. And you are tackling a very important issue on relations between refugees and the host population and the issues of peaceful existence between refugees and host populations, but from the perspective of social work, also from the perspective of Ubuntu. So this is exciting. I just want to learn a little bit more from you, given that you introduce yourself, that you have a background in social work, you are rooted in social work, and we know that in Africa, we are trying to do indigenization of social work. We are trying to decolonize social work, and this sort of ties in with your concept of decoloniality, post-coloniality, among others. So I want to understand, for example, how you are thinking in terms of using social worker theories, like the strengths-based perspective, which is very important in social work, especially developmental social work, like empowerment and capacity enhancement to strengthen resilience of refugees, but also the host populations. If you can speak a little bit more to that, I will enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
I think the social work lens that I brought to this work was person and environment. That's what I looked at the most, is because I realized that the experiences of the refugee community in Malawi are very closely tied to the environment, that the stigma and the discrimination cannot be separated from the environment. And as I started to poke into that, it led me to look at sort of the macro picture beyond just the people around the camp or the people in the camp. And it led me further and further into, policy and history. And so social work being interdisciplinary sort of set me down that track to ask those questions. Even though I have sort of limited understanding of policy or history, they were things that I was able to find out from the literature that I pulled into the work. And so I think one of the things that I encountered in my work was that there comes a point where sort of the policy issues, the historical issues become more removed from the everyday experience. And that's where my curiosity kicked in with the festival, that it's bringing attention to those things, that getting us to think about those things again, as opposed to just focusing on how the refugee community is being treated, but that realizing that that's actually a product of a bigger systemic issue. So that's sort of the key social work lens that I brought in. But I like that you highlight the empowerment perspective. I think that's definitely important, because oftentimes the narrative surrounding the refugee experience is one of victimization, and not as much is drawn to the strengths that are brought in particular with this festival, the artistic wealth that's brought in, that is also generating socioeconomic impact. So I think that's something that's definitely important to incorporate, like highlighting the strengths and the empowerment and the agency of the refugee community within itself, but also that it's imparting to its host community.
Wow, thanks a lot. That is extremely fascinating, that you bring in the notion of person and environment, and then how that sort of fits in again with issues of strengths-based perspective, capacity enhancement, and you started to bring in the issue of agency, which I like very much. And you know that we are now talking not just about individual agency, but also collective agency. And when we start to speak of collective agency, that takes us also towards Ubuntu. So it would be interesting if you can comment about the issue of agency, yes, individual agency, collective agency, and the Ubuntu, and how this sort of informs your work. Thanks a lot. Over.
Before we talk about Ubuntu, and I want to get there, I have some questions and suggestions about the project, a sort of big picture perspective on it. So I thought the discussion of the festival was really interesting and suggestive, and lots of ideas were popping in my head when I read your paper, and also when I listened to your overview at this point. But I thought one way to, one distinction that might be useful to draw is between two different kinds of projects you might have in respect of considering the festival. So on the one hand, you might have a descriptive goal. You might be trying to get us to understand more about what's happening in Malawi. On the other hand, you might have a prescriptive goal. You might want to say that some agent should or shouldn't do something. When I read the paper, it sounded like it was a merely descriptive project. You were simply recounting what's going on here, and it is interesting and important. But in your talk today, it sounded like you also had a prescriptive aim. You wanted to suggest that we shouldn't merely help refugees by providing themselves safe havens and food, for example, but another viable and desirable way of helping refugees is by fostering these kinds of events, which I thought was really interesting. So would it be fair to say you've got both prescriptive and descriptive aims in the project? Let's start there.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. And I like that you point out that the prescriptive aim does not come out as strongly, because I think the bulk of the paper is laying that foundation with the historical piece, the political piece, and then it's only towards the end that I start to really engage with the festival. So I think there's definitely room for improvement there. I think I would like to restory more those different things so that that prescriptive aspect comes out stronger. Because studied separately, sort of they don't communicate that goal of what's going on and why. It's just kind of like, this is the history, these are the policies, this is what's happening. But weaved together, you know, with more of that prescriptive dimension, I think would strengthen the argument that's there.
Look, for all I know, that would be a really interesting point, but it's not my field. I'm a philosopher. I'm not a social worker or even a public policy person. But my second suggestion then is related to that. Given that you have a prescriptive aim, that you want to suggest that some changes should be made, and presumably on the part of the government of Malawi and the citizens of Malawi. Then one further piece of advice is then to contextualize your contribution relative to the literature that comes closest to it. So it's important when we do a PhD to highlight what's original about our work. And one of my strongest pieces of advice when people are trying to publish is also to differentiate their findings or their discoveries from what others have said on the topic. So as you go forward, I think it'd be worth your while to point out that this kind of prescription that you're wanting to make has been absent from, for example, the social work literature, and that would require you to say what's been present in that literature. So there have been suggestions that we do X, Y, and Z in respect of refugees. I'm going to suggest this further way that governments and host citizens ought to engage with refugees. And then that will bring out your original contribution in the doctorate, and it will make it easier for you to get published as well.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
My third piece of advice is to pay attention to the verbs you use when you are spelling out your thesis. So in the paper I read, the verbs you used were on the one hand explore, and on the other discuss. And today when you spoke of deconstructing or drawing attention to or speaking to. And from the ear of a philosopher, these words are vague. They don't commit you to much, right? If you're going to discuss something or explore something, that doesn't commit you to a specific conclusion. It doesn't commit you to a specific recommendation. And so once you've got that prescription to make, and you can show that this would be a desirable way of helping refugees, then my advice is to find verbs that are stronger. And that do commit you to something, to saying, I'm going to defend this thesis, or I'm going to argue for this claim, or I'm going to make this recommendation. Those are more forceful kinds of claims, and they're scary to make when we are emerging researchers, because now we've got to show, we've got to do the arguing, we've got to do the defending. But it's really what we want to see in scholarship, and it again will make your work of more interest to both scholars and policymakers, is my suggestion.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see there's definitely room to be more emphatic, more direct. I think when I was writing initially, what went through my mind was how this is very anecdotal, because it's just focusing on one very specific community. And so I was trying to be cautious about over generalizing, but I see how I missed there that having a decisive aspect to it. So that's something I can see myself definitely circling back to and saying, even though this is just one specific instance, but there's still a case that can be made for it, that it's worth emulating. So that's something that I'll definitely take to heart.
I think that's true. I mean, you could make the recommendation merely in respect to Malawi. I mean, that would be a way of limiting the scope. But I don't think you should. I mean, I think you should generalize and say, look, if it holds for Malawi, it's going to hold for cases that are relevantly similar to Malawi. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable point to make and defend. I think I'm gonna pass the ball back to Professor Paul.
Thank you very much. I like your points, Prof. They are very building. Thank you for that. I just want to build on that, still around concepts, that it would be very important, because you talk of peace, peaceful coexistence, it would be important to define what you mean by these concepts like peace, because they have been defined variously and they carry different meanings in different contexts. There is cultural relativism in the way people live, observe, and draw meanings about peace. So it would be very important for you to clarify what you mean by peace. Are you defining peace from the perspective of energetic pieces that look at peace in a holistic sense? Are you defining them in terms of moral pieces, which draw more around morality and religion, but defining religion in the broadest sense possible? Are you looking at modern pieces, postmodern pieces, transrational pieces? So it would be very important to clarify the perspective of peace studies that you bring into social work and into this context of Tumani, which is a very good, a very interesting ritual that is going on. And you may want to know, is Tumani a representation of, for example, the holistic approach to peace studies promoted by John Paul Lederer, or it is going more towards more of the prescriptive models that are projected by Johan Galtung. So you may need to, in terms of position, you might need to mention that. Also, it is very important in terms of positionality for us to understand who you are in relation to what you are studying, such that we know if there are certain prejudices, we know who is Emmanuel as he engages in this research on relations between host populations and refugees. But beyond that, you also have to be careful, especially when we look at identity politics and peace studies, to see what does refugee mean? What does host population mean? Because these refugees are heterogeneous. And if you bring in the theory of intersectionality, they are intersecting. Refugees just one of the aspects, but one is a refugee, she's a woman or a man, the socioeconomic status might be different, the ethnicity is different, the nationality is different. So there is a lot of complexity around what refugee means, and a lot of complexity also around what it means to be host population. So taking that into account, especially borrowing from, since social work is an eclectic field of study, borrowing from feminist theories around intersectionality might help you to unpack the identity politics around refugees and host populations. Over, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Paul. When I was reading the essay in preparation for our meeting today, one thing that stood out for me is the need to theorize more some of the concepts that are just sort of introduced but not really engaged with. It occurred to me that the paper touches on so many different things but doesn't adequately unpack them. So I like that you point out specifically issues that I could focus on, like the identity piece. I think that's a central one as well, because I argue that the notion of identity on which the stigma is based is one that can be sort of taken apart, and the commonality can be found between the host community and the refugee community through identity. And so I like that you point out, some tangible concepts that I can theorize around more. so that when I get to making those sort of decisive claims, then I've laid the foundation and situated myself in the literature, like Professor Metz said, sort of highlighting what's been done before, what's been said. I think I definitely see need for that. There's a lot that could be unpacked more, so that the arguments are stronger. But also, I'm curious to learn more about how these other schools of thought are talking about these concepts that I touch on in passing.
So just a little comment here for both for Emmanuel, but also for Professor Bukuluki and Professor Metz. Since most of the people here have not read the paper, when we make reference to the paper, can we try to be very specific about, okay, in your paper you say this, then get to the question. The same thing, Emmanuel, when you respond, so that we can carry the rest of the people here with us in the conversation. And we have maybe 8 more minutes of this conversation before we open up to the audience. So Professor Metz, back to you.
Okay. I'd like to start talking a bit about Ubuntu. I see all sorts of Ubuntu going on in this festival, but the one that stands out the most, and the one you spoke to today, Emmanuel, was something about sharing a sense of self or having a common sense of identity between the refugees on the one hand and members of the host country on the other. And I think I wanted to add to that thought, and then I wanted to raise a bit of a problem for it from the perspective of Ubuntu. So you appealed to the idea that there's a shared ancestry between the peoples involved, and that could be one thing. But when I think of Ubuntu, I think of other kinds of things beyond that, that you might also find of use. So one idea is the tradition of hospitality amongst Indigenous African peoples. Well known that for many, when a visitor would come, they'd be put up for some days and fed and welcomed. And Nelson Mandela, when he's asked, what does Ubuntu mean? There's a video on YouTube somewhere that he says, well, he doesn't provide a comprehensive definition. He says, well, here's an example of Ubuntu. It's this tradition of hospitality. So I thought that might be a rich source of ideas for you when thinking about at least the kind of Ubuntu we'd like to see. Another idea is the idea of human dignity. So it wouldn't be that unique to these particular peoples, but all human beings have a dignity by many strains of Indigenous African ethical thought. Common is the view that we all have a divine spark, we're children of God, and so that all makes us special and worthy of engagement and worthy of respect. And a third idea that's common to find is a notion of a human family, that we're all members of that broad community, and again, entitled to a certain kind of moral treatment. You will find those three ideas in the work of Kwame Gyekye, and in particular, his essay on African ethics in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And they might give you further grounds for thinking that for thinking about what Ubuntu does look like and what it ought to look like if it were advanced in certain ways. But the one puzzle I want to raise is that I think while there are these ideas in African ethical thought and Ubuntu that are impartial, right, that ascribe an equal status to all of us, that are egalitarian or cosmopolitan, there's also a strain of African thought that's more partial and says something like family first. Or charity begins at home. Those are also very familiar. And they pull in the other direction. And so, you know, I mean, one way to see this is I've got most reason to look after my kids, not your kids. They're my kids and family first. And it's appropriate by most interpretations of African morality for me to prioritize aid to my children. Similarly, my colleagues come first before your colleagues. I need to help my colleagues in the first instance, not your colleagues, even if the needs are the same, or even if there's somewhat greater need on the part of your colleagues. And now what goes for children and colleagues might go for compatriots. Maybe I should prioritize if I'm the government, maybe I should prioritize resources to citizens before refugees. And I don't have a firm answer to whether that, how to answer that question, but it's a live question. And it seems integral to at least common interpretations of Ubuntu. So I just wanted to give you those ideas and that reference that might be of interest.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like how those thoughts problematize, sort of the appeal to that shared ancestry, that there's got to be a balancing of, so I think there's insight there to better critique maybe the policies and point out sort of the merits of it, and also sort of challenge a little bit the parts that are causing some challenges for the refugee community. And I'll definitely look at those principles of Ubuntu. I think participating in the dialogues, one thing I was looking for also was to see how to incorporate Ubuntu into the work. It wasn't explicitly mentioned in the paper, but that's something that I've been wanting to expand on. And so I like that you highlight how there's places where that can be done more aptly.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think these naturally fit. I mean, one question I had for you is what was going back to that notion that you've got a prescription in mind. How would you like to see more Ubuntu? What should the government do there, or what should citizens do? What should the media do? Have you thought about those things yet, or is that on the agenda?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is how, because the camp is a protracted refugee situation, sort of seeing more opportunities for integration, because even though, the policies and the law holds, but in practice, the refugee community has a lived experience that's not too far removed from the average citizen. And so, legitimizing that, those are some of the things I think about. That's one way of sort of welcoming, like to use the language that you shared, welcoming an existing community that's within the national borders into sort of the social fabric of the country.
I thought it would have been useful to say more about give us more empirical facts. So I was curious, how does the media report on the festival? I was curious how many Malawian citizens attend the festival? What's the government's attitude towards it? Does it provide any money? I was very curious about those kinds of engagements.
Yeah, I think moving forward, I want to take more of a textual analysis approach, with the essay, because I need to draw more on these public available sources, because it's not taking that traditional approach of data collection. And so to improve the rigor, I really want to veer towards more textual analysis. And I think that's where I can pull from sort of the media, those government documents, and have more of that empirical edge to it. At the moment, it does read a lot like commentary, even though I cite these sources and whatnot, but there's definitely room for more, to bring in more of those sources so that they can speak to each other and then also inform that argument that I'm trying to make.
That's right. The more we know about what's actually happening, the better your recommendations are going to be.
Yeah, I just want to add one or two statements to that. That considering actually an ethnographic approach, whether this will be relatively short than the traditional ethnography, I think would be very good for you to really get embedded and to be able to understand the relational dynamics, and also to understand what happens after this ritual or after this festival. What happens after that? Does it continue, or it is simply temporal and people are just using a mask to say, oh, we are here, we like refugees, this is the spirit of Ubuntu, and then after that, we don't know actually what happens. So getting embedded, I think would be very helpful, and ethnographic approaches are quite good at.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Emmanuel and to Professor Bukuluki and Professor Metz. We want to shift now to invite the audience. And again, let's try and make this a conversation. It's not really like Emmanuel has all the answers. I think a lot of people in the room, you have very strong feelings one way or the other on issues around Ubuntu, about refugees in Malawi and elsewhere. So let's try to frame this as a conversation among us as people who care about these issues. Definitely, we want to focus on Emmanuel's work. And I know that most of us have not read his paper, but if Emmanuel is open to it, we can send it around to those who want to give him more feedback. But for now, let's respond to the issues that came up in the conversation. Because we do have quite some bit of time, we are very open to letting you unmute yourself and speak. The tech team that we have here can help us with that. If you would like to speak, you can raise your hand, use the hand icon on Zoom. You can raise your hand, and then Evandre can help us with giving you room to speak. Otherwise, feel free to put your questions or your comments in the question and answer box, and we can take them from there. So my colleague Mariki is going to help me with that if there are questions that are there, but otherwise feel free to show us if you would like to speak. I also know that Elizabeth, earlier on, you had your hand up. If you are open to speaking now, we can get you unmuted so that you can give us your contribution.
I had just written my question in the chat. It's not really a question as such, but I want to thank Emmanuel for his presentation. I haven't had the advantage of reading his paper, but just to say, as a former legal advisor to UNHCR, and at the time, during 92 to 94, I lived in Mozambique. At the time that repatriation was taking place from Malawi and from actually 7 different countries at the time, that Mozambicans were returning, more than 1.3 million returned to Mozambique. So I was touched by what you said about the legal framework being biased towards voluntary repatriation at that time. And I just, as somebody who was involved in the process, I just wanted to point out that actually these were the wishes of the Mozambicans at that time after the peace accord was signed between Renamo and Frelimo. And people were canvassed, they wanted to come home. And thereafter, obviously, it's up to the government of Malawi, as it was with all the other neighboring countries, to then legislate accordingly to the new populations that were coming in, as you've mentioned, from the DRC, and I'm sure you have probably quite a few Somalis and other nationalities from the continent. So yes, voluntary repatriation at that time was seen as being the best option, but each population is treated differently. I mean, according to the wishes, either on an individual basis or as a group. But I would like to know how the festival is being used to bring these different, refugees from different backgrounds, whether they're urban refugees, whether they're more rural, and the different languages. Obviously, some are francophone from perhaps Rwanda, Burundi, and from the DRC itself. So how is the festival using those commonalities to bring people together, regardless of their country of origin? Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's very insightful, especially the part about how the legal framework responded to the wishes of the people and the situation as was unfolding. To comment more on the second part, where you asked about how the festival is bringing people together, what comes to mind first is how Malawi has this policy of encampment, and so by default, all these people groups are, for the most part, at the camp. There are some urban refugees, but that's more the exception. They get express permission from the camp administrator to live outside the camp, but for the most part, the majority of the current population of 50,000 refugees reside at the camp. And so on a daily basis, from what I've come to learn and observe, there's already this ongoing cultural exchange. And so I think what the festival does is it amplifies the existing cultural diversity that's there, because some of the activities that take place during the festival also take place at other times during the year, different moments, occasions. And so I think the festival, in a sense, pulls together and strengthens existing practices, both artistic and social. Those are some of the thoughts that are coming to mind, but I think we could definitely talk more about it and see if we can highlight other things.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your comments and your question, and thank you, Emmanuel. If we don't have a question right now, I would like to pose a question to both Dr. Metz and Dr. Bukuluki. I'm curious as to how you think Ubuntu makes sense for Emmanuel's paper directly, but how does Ubuntu make sense in academia in terms of using Ubuntu as a framework to think through the work that we do, whether it's in social work or whether it's in conservation ecology, whether it's what's the value that's there, and what are some of the challenges. I think I wanted to see if you could speak from Emmanuel's work, but then broaden out and speak more broadly about what's the value and what are the challenges of deploying Ubuntu as a lens to think about our work.
I guess I'll jump in. I guess I thought Ubuntu could figure into Emmanuel's project in two different ways. And again, drawing on that earlier distinction between describing on the one hand and prescribing on the other. So one area where it might be of use is just in helping us understand what's motivating people. What's driving them to participate in the festival or support the festival or engage with the festival in certain ways. And it might be certain Indigenous African beliefs about personhood and virtue. And so that's one kind of angle, is to get inside the heads of the participants or the supporters, or conceivably the detractors, and see whether they are drawing on ideas that we would associate with Ubuntu. But the other way is to invoke Ubuntu as an ethic, as a prescription for how to live, which I take at the core to be the idea that we ought to develop our personhood or become genuine human beings, and to do that roughly by relating harmoniously with others, entering into community with them. And so another way that Emmanuel could invoke Ubuntu is to spell that out in some detail, tell us what it looks like to harmonize with others or to enter into community with them, to be fairly specific about that. And then draw on that kind of principled interpretation of Ubuntu to make some prescriptions, to say, well, the government ought to fund the festival, or the media ought to devote airtime to the festival, or citizens ought to visit and they ought to donate. I mean, once we have these kinds of prescriptive terminology of should and ought, or it would be right or good, when we have normative language like that, it would be natural to ground it in a certain interpretation of African morality. So those are the two that pop out at me.
Yeah, and if I can add on that, on what has been laid out very well by Professor Metz, I would simply say that Ubuntuism would not have come at a better time than now, when there is a growing interest and call for indigenization and decolonization of social work, conceptualization, training, and practice, and to make it more relevant to the cultural and socio-economic context of Africa, to the social norms in Africa, whether it is making it relevant to challenging these social norms or actually to identifying the cultural resources within the African social norms that we can use to promote social worker values. Because yes, we know that there are some harmful social norms within the cultural context of Africa, And I'm using Africa very carefully because I know that Africa is not homogeneous. It is relative, it is heterogeneous. And I'm also using Ubuntu carefully because it could also have inherently contradictory norms that don't align, for example, with social values. But I also know that Ubuntu worldview is based on values of intense humanity, caring, sharing, respect, compassion, ensuring a happy and qualitative community life, a spirit of family. And we can really borrow from these values to enrich indigenization of social work by rooting it within the Ubuntu philosophy, but also being aware, actually, of its inherent contradictions and some aspects of it that could contradict social work. Because within the social norms, you could be asked actually to, if they are in the framework of social norms, there are also sanctions. If you don't adhere to certain values prescribed by Ubuntu, whether these are positive or negative, there are sanctions. So Ubuntu could also be a hostage taker, limiting individual freedoms. So we have to be very careful, since social work is based on rights, it is based on promoting agency, it is based on self-determination and strengths-based approach and promoting resilience. We have to be careful when Ubuntu is appropriate, it should be appropriately used, and if not, we should also be critical about the harmful norms to make sure that human rights are there too. Thank you.
Yeah, I do think that if you are going to use Ubuntu as a moral framework to guide your prescriptions about public policy, it probably won't be enough simply to read off Ubuntu from an actual community. You're probably going to need to interpret it in a way that's attractive, in the way that Professor Paul has suggested. And so that might well involve using your own judgment about what you find appealing about Ubuntu, or at least certain interpretations of it, and otherwise not. I also agree with my colleague that now's the time. I've poked around a little bit on the web for essays on Ubuntu and social work, and the things that pop up were published only in the past 2 years. It really looks like a new field for all I can tell. And so that should make your, that's all the better for your project, to broaden our horizons in thinking about social work. I think it's an opportune time for this project.
So Emmanuel, as we wait for Mariki to bring in any other comments here, just a quick one. So where are you with your dissertation? Is it a good time to try to bring an Ubuntu lens into the work when it was not there from the beginning? How do you do this without making it like an afterthought? So how do you make it part of the fabric of your dissertation work or beyond, without making it almost like it's an add-on?
Right. Actually, yeah, I'm at the pre-comprehensive exam point, so I'm at the drawing board. So this is actually good timing. At this point, I could, completely take a whole new direction and rethink things. I think I have the core sort of population and themes in mind, but now methodology is still developing and I'm still reading. So all this insight is actually very practical for me. And I like how, it was pointed out that there's things from Ubuntu that can be aligned with social work, and then there's things that can be questioned further. So yeah, I guess the short answer is I'm not too far in that I cannot meaningfully incorporate these insights. So it's really to my advantage that I'm getting to have this conversation, and that I can sort of go back and rethink some of the things that I had thought about, because, you only know what you know until you have the introduction of new thoughts and ideas that cause you to think differently. So I'm thankful that Professor Metz and Professor Bukuluki could share these ideas with me this early on in my study.
Upenyu, there is a question from, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Utitifon Imyang. and he is saying, apart from sociality and ethics, does Ubuntu as a frame of conceptualization articulate specific representational values with regards to artistic production? In other words, does the frame of Ubuntu enable particular insights into art forms like this festival and other forms of related artistic practice? It's a she, sorry.
It's a brilliant question.
Yeah, and just a note here, UT tends to be academic-y. I wonder if she's willing to actually ask this question in person to unpack it, if you would like. If not, Emmanuel and Dr. Bukuluki and Dr. Metz, you are more than welcome to address it.
Hi, thanks for calling me out, Ukwenyu. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so I didn't arrive at the beginning because of some technical difficulties, but from what I'm listening so far, I find it very interesting, the ways in which Ubuntu as a concept is being problematized and not just taken for granted as it often is in other conversational contexts. So the reason why I'm asking this is also in my research, I'm trying to understand how specific African philosophies can be understood beyond the social and ethical implications that they have, to be pushed a little bit to understand their epistemological, dimensions. So I'm wondering, especially since Emmanuel is looking at this festival, when we use Ubuntu as a critical methodology, as a frame of reading, are there particular indices that can stand out to say, this is how art operates when understood in the context of Ubuntu, or this is what Ubuntu makes visible about art? I like the making the invisible visible part. So, and this might not be a question Emmanuel has engaged with already because he's still in the introduction. So I'm curious about what the professors will think about African philosophies as artistic frames of representation that makes visible other aspects of, human engagement beyond just saying, oh, it's social or the ethical implications. Thank you very much.
Yeah, look, I think that's a brilliant question. I don't do work in philosophy of art or aesthetics, but I can point you to some people who have done it. And my first place to look would be the work of K. Anyanwu, who was an Igbo Nigerian philosopher. And I think his essays, I haven't read them for many years, but I remember them being quite rich in thought about how Ubuntu might be used to interpret art and understand aesthetic practice. But I can't speak to it. It's really not my expertise. But that would be one place to look. And I think the suggestion of interpreting what goes on in the festival through the lens of Ubuntu, aesthetically, not merely ethically, I think it's a terrific suggestion.
I want to add to that, and just to say that I think not much research has been done on that, and not much theorizing has been done on that, especially in the context of social work. But I think that it provides a great opportunity to explore how we can use Ubuntu to theorize around these issues, beyond sociality, of course, beyond ethics, but to look at how we can use it in art in order to project those areas where it is at intersection with the social worker values, for example. Over.
Emmanuel, did you want to come in before we take another question? I see there's another question that just got posted. Did you want to respond to UT as well?
I'm just as curious and keen to learn more. I think after our webinar, I'll go start reading up on the indigenization of social work and see how this can come in. So yeah, I'm keen listening at this point.
Penyu, I have a question that actually links to the previous question in terms of the whole sense of witnessing and being witnessed that the arts offer us. So there is one question, but if you don't mind, because my question links to the previous question, I think I I just want to pose it to all three of you. So Professor Pumla Gobodo-Marikizela writes a lot about the possibilities of the arts to help us, if I say us, traumatized communities or disrupted communities to work through these events. And she then articulates Ubuntu as part of that process of witnessing and of being witness, in the sense, if I understand her correctly, that it is in this human connection where someone says, I will witness you, I will look at you, I will see you. It is in that moment that space is provided for the other person to become a different kind of person. So I become a different person through that interaction with other human beings. And I was wondering if in your research about the festival, if you have seen or have evidence of this kind of transformative moments. So I guess what I'm asking is, on a practical level, are there signs that the people who come into contact with the refugees at Dzaleka, or the people who are involved in the festival who come to see the festival events, is there actually evidence that it is changing the way people engage with one another, or is it changing how people relate to refugees? What have you seen around that?
As we were conversing earlier, and Professor Metz sort of alluded to the need for pulling from different sources, an idea that came to mind was looking at how the reporting has been done over the past 7 years that the festival has been in existence, to see if I can tease out something from there. That's one thought that came to mind, is I'm curious to go back and then look at the reporting that has been done. There's been some footage that's been put out, some sort of, I guess, mini documentaries, and there's been articles written. It's been very descriptive also, but I think sort of some of that media source material can maybe speak better to that transformation. But anecdotally, I would say from what I saw and read, the festival has opened up this conversation in people's mind to what was maybe an invisible community. And so there's definitely an appeal to that, I guess, the humanity side of things, because that's kind of what Trésor wanted to do, is to appeal to the community, that the suffering was real and that there was really a lot of hardship being faced by the community at Zalika. So I think there's definitely things that I could probe into more to sort of bring that out, to actually be able to show that there was a before and after, or that there's this ongoing change. And I think a good starting point maybe will be some of those reports. And then I could also, Professor Paul had talked about sort of some ethnographic approach. So talking to patrons, I think, and also that could supplement some of the sort of official reporting, but also hearing from the people who attend, the people in the surrounding villages and communities. And then, because a lot of the things I write on, I think, pull from the community itself and how they feel and what they're going through. But I'm curious, like you mentioned, to learn about that transformation, that as validation of the experience is happening, what are those changes then?
Yeah, that was a terrific suggestion. I mean, the one side of it that was being asked about was, does this benefit the refugees? Do they go through some kind of transformation as a result of their works of art being apprehended as a kind of listening, sort of analogous to listening to somebody in a therapeutic setting? I mean, I think it's a brilliant, really interesting suggestion. But another side of it might be, even if there isn't that transformation, are people more empathetic? Are people more sympathetic? Are they putting themselves in other people's shoes? Are they becoming more compassionate? Even if it doesn't mean a transformation for people in the camp, we might see more Ubuntu outside the camp, in the sense of people at least identifying with them and putting themselves in the shoes of the refugees. So you might look for Ubuntu within the camp on the one hand and then outside it on the other.
And I just wanted to add on that, Prof. Nets, that definitely art therapy is a well-established field, and so artistic methods and techniques are really very helpful in terms of, especially mental health, in terms of psychosocial support. But I also wanted to note that in social work, relationships are central. So relationships are central to social work. And we believe that it is through creating a relationship of empathy, of understanding, of communicating with each other that actually transformation starts. And also if you link this to peace studies, the whole issue of the whole notion of Gandhi saying that the road to peace is peace. The road to peace is peace, looking at peace as a process. So when you start at least to communicate, to talk, to listen to each other, to act together, to think together, that brings a process that may, be therapeutic in itself in different ways. So I think that given that conflict is a relational phenomenon, tension is something relational, and that also healing is something relational, of relationships between refugees and host populations. I think just providing that opportunity structure for them to interact, for them to communicate, for them to sing and dance together starts off a process of change.
Upenyu, there are two questions about references, or one suggestion about references, and the one is a reference to the work of Professor van Breda and V. Mavurira. And then there's a question, Professor Metz, to ask if you could share the reference to Anyanwu, because the person wanted, so maybe if you can put it in the chat file. And then there is a question from Anli David to say, could the festival be seen as an artifact of Ubuntu?
Well,
that's a sign that it's a really good question there. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, I'm thinking that in a way it is an artifact because it is an expression and people can give it different interpretations. It may not be physical, but it is a ritual. So if you look at singing as ritualistic, dancing as ritualistic, and if you look at the exchanges that take place as in the form of rituals, then in a way they are moving towards being artifacts, although they may not be physical artifacts.
Thank you, Dr. Bukuluki. Emmanuel, did you want to come in?
Sure. I was thinking about the notion of hospitality within Ubuntu and how just having the refugee presence there is in itself a form of resistance that has given birth to this artifact. I think if Ubuntu is teaching there that hospitality is the way, then having this community there sort of necessitates that it be welcomed, I guess. So I guess a case can be made for it along those lines. Those are the thoughts that are coming to mind.
Wonderful, thank you. And Emmanuel, if you don't mind me, unless Dr. Metz had something to say about that, I wanted to ask a different question. So if you don't mind taking us back to the title of your paper, could you unpack it a little bit? What is being made visible, and what are the implications? The reason I'm asking is we might see value in making the invisible visible, but there's also a flip side whereby making that invisible visible means it becomes an eyesore, or you expose refugee populations to victimization. So there is a positive slant to your title. Is that the case in the context you are studying, or are there repercussions for becoming visible for the refugee populations. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in the essay, I touch on cultural production as distinguished from cultural performance. And so with culture performance, I comment on how that's understood to be those activities, the dances, the singing and everything. And that with cultural production, there's an intentionality of meaning making. And I think this is where the making the invisible visible comes in that there's a critical element that's being added to those cultural performances. So, for example, some of the content of the performances is very explicit in addressing refugee stigma and discrimination. Some of the songs, like specifically, and the poetry, there's a very direct narrative on what's going on. It's not sort of just in passing, or there's a clear outcry of the hardships that are being faced. And so there's that aspect, which, like I pointed out, might stir the pot maybe, but also in just making this community visible. I think it's a safety net in itself, because if these things are happening under a veil, then there's the harm that they'll just go on unaddressed. But if these things are brought out into the light, then hopefully the hope is that action can start to be taken. But even if there's no like system level action taken, we can see a shift in empathy, in concern, and small scale interventions that are meaningful to the individuals that are on the receiving end of them. And hopefully that has a ripple effect. So that's kind of what I was getting at with that, because the festival really has caused national conversation. It's regarded as a big deal annually, because there aren't that many festivals that are held. So the fact that this is a refugee founded and run festival, you cannot but talk about the refugee community and acknowledge it at the very least. There's that, and hopefully that starts conversations, because even the festival itself has been recognized globally, and so there has been some traffic that it's generated just by reason of being.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We have 15 minutes, and I wanted to get back to Mariki to see if there's any more questions or outstanding issues. Then I will circle back to the panelists here in a moment for their closing thoughts. Would love to hear from each one of you as you pull all these strands together. But before we do that, I wanted to get back to Mariki.
There are no outstanding questions that I can see. Thank you very much for the references that you put in the chat file. That's very useful. And no outstanding questions that I can see or comments.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So why don't we shift back here to, I'm not sure what the order would be. Emmanuel, would you like to go first? You could kind of pull all the strings together, how you are making sense of the feedback you got today and some of the questions that still remain for you. And then we'll go to Professor Metz and then Professor Bukuluki to close.
Thanks, Upenyu. I think following this conversation, I intend to interrogate more the intersection of Ubuntu and social work. I think prior to this conversation, I had struggled with how to situate these things that I'm interested in within our field of study. And so now I can go back to the drawing board and tangibly see direction. I'm really curious to see how sort of the artistic side of things can speak to Ubuntu and vice versa, and how that also makes inroads into social work. So when Professor Paul talked about the indigenization of social work, and the thought that came to mind was, wow, that's very broad. Like, how can I situate even this within that? But now I'm starting to see tangible avenues for that. Yeah, I think I've enjoyed having this conversation. I think it's challenged me. It's also broadened my thought. And just thank you, Professor Paul and Professor Metz. And I look forward to continuing our conversations and beyond the webinar.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And just a note here, I think the references that got posted, Yuti is saying, I think they might have been posted just to the panelists. I'm not sure whether that's the case.
I think that's right. I'll get on it.
Okay, wonderful.
I'm changing it as we speak. I'm changing.
Okay.
Thank you.
So go ahead, and Dr. Metz and Dr. Bukuluki, whoever wants to go first.
I'm unmuted. I'll just start. Congratulations, Emmanuel. I mean, you've got a nice start. You've clearly got a nice core of a project. It's very suggestive. There are a number of different avenues you could take, and quite a number of them are rich, and would, I think, for all I know of the literature, add something to it. I thought the sort of aesthetic or healing dimension was one I hadn't really thought through, and I was glad colleagues raised it today. I thought it was a really valuable contribution to see Ubuntu through an aesthetic lens or through a healing lens, and not so much in a narrow kind of ethical framework that I was inclined to use. So I think you've received some really great feedback. I wish I'd had something like this when I was a second-year doctoral student. Congratulations to you, and keep going. Good luck.
I just want to emulate my colleague, Professor Metz, by thanking you very much, Emmanuel, for and definitely the organizers of this event, for providing a platform, this platform, which has been very eye-opening to me to begin with, because I've learned a lot in the process, from the comments, from the feedback. But I think that I congratulate you, Emmanuel, in particular, for thinking about this topic and also being brave to come out here at the initial stages, at the formative phase of your project, of your thesis, to open up for being critiqued constructively, among others. So this is wonderful. And I think that in social work, sometimes we have been very narrow focused, and opening up to these kind of topics, I think, opens up lots of opportunity structures. And Emmanuel, you being able now to look at the current discussions around the peace, humanitarian development nexus, because you are trying to say, oh, this is a protracted crisis, and we now need to see how we can start improving relationships between the host population and the refugees, such that we foster more integration. I think that your project has a lot of potential to contribute a lot. And you are also now beginning to look at the Ubuntu, which is a big philosophy in, I say philosophy in quotes, because some people critique Ubuntu sometimes as not being philosophy or as a developing philosophy. So I'm being careful, given that we have a philosopher here. I'm in sort of a ground that is not mine. But what I'm trying to say is that being able to look at Ubuntu, which is a philosophy respected almost across sub-Saharan Africa, I think is very important. So I'm looking forward to the contribution that you're engaging with Ubuntu in a humanitarian setting, in a refugee setting, looking at how that can improve relationships between refugees and host populations, a very hot topic, because increasingly there are more refugees. Africa is hosting more refugees than anywhere else. Here in Uganda, where I sit alone, we are the second largest host of refugees. And the kind of issue you are dealing with is very important for East Africa as we host more refugees. And also given that conflicts are just growing in the region, and every other day we have challenges around refugees. So fixing the issue of how we can use Ubuntu, that we sort of believe in, but don't understand very well, to use it as a framing for improving relationships between the host population and refugees is extremely important. I want to thank you. Over.
Thank you so very much to Emmanuel for sharing with us your work and for being open, like Professor Bukuluki said, to getting feedback and sometimes critique. And thank you to Professor Metz. I know we know, and Professor Bukuluki, your schedules are extremely busy, but thank you for sharing your time with us. We hope that this is a conversation that will continue growing. One thing that we really value about the Ubuntu Dialogues project is that we try to think about Ubuntu both as a concept, but also as practice. And we try to think from concept to practice, what does that intersection look like? And hopefully this conversation is part of pushing that agenda forward. As I said at the beginning, we do have our next Ubuntu Dialogues webinar scheduled for Tuesday, November 9. So I might have said November 11 at the beginning. It should be November 9, Tuesday. This is the last webinar we have for this calendar year. We do have others coming up in the 2022 year, but this one is the last this calendar year. The title is In the Spirit of Ubuntu, a New Vision of Society and the Self. And this webinar will feature 3 very important people. I think everyone is important, but we are really looking forward to this. Dr. Snetemba Makanya, Dr. Ashwin Tyson, and Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela. And we look forward to having you join us when we meet for this session. Thank you, my colleagues, for posting this flyer here. Otherwise, we want to thank you, and we hope that we can continue this conversation. See you next time.